Just 60 seconds ago, a tectonic shift occurred within the ancient stone walls of Buckingham Palace. A shockwave so profound, it has fundamentally altered the future of the British monarchy. This isn't mere gossip or tabloid speculation. This is the moment King Charles III, the sovereign of the United Kingdom, stepped out of the shadows to expose the most calculated betrayal of his reign. In his trembling hands lies a document that was never meant to see the light of day, a secret draft of his royal will, meticulously altered to strike at the very heart of his legacy. Two names, once destined for greatness, were missing. Not commoners, not distant relatives, but his own flesh and blood, Prince Louis and Princess Charlotte. Imagine the scene in the king's private study, a room usually defined by the scent of old leather, ink, and centuries of tradition. Charles had settled in for what he assumed would be a morning of mundane bureaucracy, financial structures, ceremonial approvals, and inheritance drafts. But then, a red-sealed envelope arrived, marked with the crest of utmost confidentiality. An unspoken weight settled in the air as he broke the wax. At first, the document seemed procedural, filled with the sterile, cold language of legal experts. But as his eyes scanned the list of beneficiaries, skipping past William and Harry, the silence in the room became deafening. His heart hammered against his ribs. He looked again, more slowly this time, hoping his eyes were playing tricks on him. But the truth was undeniable. Charlotte and Louis were gone. Their names hadn't been redacted or footnoted. They simply didn't exist on the page. It wasn't a clerical error or a tragic oversight. It was a surgical, deliberate act of erasure. And there, in the bottom margin, written in the sharp, narrow penmanship he had known for decades, were the words that turned his blood to ice. Optimized line of inheritance for economic clarity, Camilla R. His breath caught. The room seemed to freeze in time. This wasn't a legal revision. It was a declaration of war masked as bureaucracy. The fact that it bore Camilla's personal signature made it impossible to ignore. As he held the paper, memories flooded back: little Louis, chasing butterflies in the gardens of Highgrove, Charlotte, correcting her brothers with that unmistakable royal poise, and the radiant smile on Catherine's face whenever Charles doted on them. To remove them from a legacy they were born into wasn't just unthinkable, it was treasonous. But what unsettled the king most wasn't just the omission, it was the chilling, eerie calm with which it had been executed. No ink deletions, no trace of conflict, only the sanitization of the two youngest heirs as if they were ghosts. Buried beneath layers of royal formality lay a wound Charles never expected to feel. This wasn't about money. It was about blood, memory, and the very survival of the House of Windsor. The betrayal didn't scream. It whispered through the margins, and that whisper has now ignited a fire that King Charles is determined to use to cleanse his palace. The king has seen betrayal before, but never from the woman who stood beside him at his coronation. Now, he has no choice but to confront the architect behind the pen. The shock of the discovery didn't fade. It sharpened into a cold, analytical fury. King Charles knew that a betrayal of this magnitude, the surgical removal of Prince Louis and Princess Charlotte from the royal will, could not have been a solo mission. To alter a sovereign's legacy, one doesn't just need a pen. You need a network of shadows, a web of enablers who are willing to look the other way, or worse, lend their hand to the crime. As Charles sat in the heavy silence of his study, he realized he wasn't just looking at a piece of paper. He was looking at a map of a hijacked monarchy. He began to summon his most trusted inner circle, but even then, his eyes were narrowed with suspicion. For a man who has spent 70 years preparing for the crown, Charles has learned a bitter truth. Trust is the most expensive currency in a palace, and right now, he was bankrupt. He called for the senior legal advisors, the men and women who trade in the fine print of history. Their faces, usually masks of professional indifference, began to crack under the king's piercing gaze. He didn't show them the document immediately. He watched their body language, the subtle tug of a collar, the avoidance of eye contact, the slight tremor in a hand reaching for a briefcase. In the world of royal intrigue, these are the physical maps of guilt. The revelations began as a trickle and soon turned into a flood of poison. It wasn't just one memo. It was a systemic campaign of manipulation that had been months in the making. The legal staff admitted to receiving written directives not from the king's office, but from the queen's. Some claimed they were told these were prior verbal agreements made during private dinners. Others admitted they were too intimidated by Camilla's quiet authority to ask for verification. But the most chilling part was the shadow court Camilla had built behind the velvet curtains. She hadn't used threats of violence. She used the language of order and duty. She had convinced high-ranking secretaries that the monarchy was diluted and that resources needed to be concentrated on the core heirs to ensure survival in a modern world. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, convincing the king's own staff that they were protecting his crown by destroying his grandchildren's future. As Charles listened, he saw the face of the woman he had loved for decades in a terrifying new light. This wasn't the companion who had supported him through the storms of the past. This was a strategic architect who had nudged the entire internal machinery of Buckingham Palace just enough to execute her own will. The Camilla R at the bottom of that document wasn't a signature of consent, it was a signature of conquest. The king realized that while he was busy being a sovereign to the world, he had allowed an invisible empire to rise within his own home. And now, the hunt for every single signature she had unauthorizedly authorized began. The purge was no longer an option. It was a necessity for the bloodline to survive. The moment of reckoning did not take place in a grand hall or before a council. It happened in the most intimate of spaces, the king's private library. The air was thick with the scent of Earl Grey and old paper, but the warmth of the room could not mask the icy tension radiating from the sovereign. Camilla walked in with her usual poise, her head held high, draped in the quiet confidence of someone who believed her tracks were perfectly covered. She offered a practiced, queenly smile, but Charles did not return it. Instead, he studied her face. In the art of physiognomy, the eyes often betray the soul before the tongue can lie. He noticed the subtle, microscopic flicker of uncertainty in her gaze, the moment it landed on the red-sealed document sitting prominently on his mahogany desk. Charles spoke first, his voice not a shout, but a low rumble of controlled thunder. "I have spent my life reading royal decrees," he began, his fingers tracing the edges of the altered will. "I have learned to find the truth hidden between the lines of bureaucracy. But this requires no deep reading." He pushed the paper toward her, his eyes locked onto hers. "Explain to me how the names of my grandchildren, Louis and Charlotte, vanished from my legacy under your signature." Camilla did not flinch. Her reaction was not one of guilt, but of chilling, calculated logic, the hallmark of a master strategist. She didn't deny the act. She sought to justify it. "You must think like a king, Charles, not a grandfather," she replied, her tone as sharp as a winter frost. "The monarchy is under siege from public scrutiny and economic pressure. We must protect the core. Dispersing the crown's assets to those so far removed from the throne only weakens the center. I acted out of necessity. I acted for the survival of the institution." That single sentence shattered the thin glass wall between reason and rage. To hear his own grandchildren described as distractions or weaknesses was the final betrayal. Charles slammed his palm on the desk not in a fit of violence, but in absolute finality. "They are not political chess pieces," he declared, his voice trembling with a fury that had been suppressed for decades. "They are my blood. They are the future I have sworn to protect. You did not act for the monarchy, Camilla. You acted for control. You stepped over the one line I told you never to cross, the line of family." In that suffocating stillness, the mask finally slipped. The king realized he wasn't speaking to his partner or his confidant. He was speaking to a shadow that had been operating in the dark corners of his life. The emotional wall rose between them, higher than any palace rampart. Charles saw the truth. Whatever trust had once anchored their marriage was gone, replaced by a cold, hard realization that his house was divided. The architect of the plot had been unmasked, and now the king had to decide if the woman he loved was worth the future of the bloodline he served. The confrontation in the library was only the beginning. King Charles knew that for a plot of this magnitude to reach the final stages of a royal will, the corruption had to be systemic. As Camilla retreated into a chilling silence, the king turned his gaze toward the palace machinery, the secretaries, the legal clerks, and the high-ranking aides who had once sworn their lives to the crown, but had instead served a shadow. Charles was no longer just a grieving grandfather. He was a monarch, performing a surgical purge of his own house. He ordered an immediate, high-classified internal investigation, led by the few remaining men whose loyalty had survived the decay of royal bureaucracy. What they uncovered was a masterclass in manipulation. This wasn't a series of accidental oversights. It was a campaign of fear and technical forgery. One by one, senior legal advisors were brought before the king. One man, visibly shaken, confessed that he had been shown a memorandum months earlier, a document bearing a forged version of the king's signature. Replicated from an old administrative file, it was a technical plausibility designed to bypass immediate scrutiny. He admitted that the Queen's office had pressured him, hinting that his past financial irregularities would be brought to light if he dared to question the optimization of the inheritance list. The plot had been executed through a shadow court, a group of enablers Camilla had handpicked to bypass the king's official channels. Memos were backdated, archive logs were altered to conceal when the will had been modified, and duplicate drafts that contained the original, unaltered names of Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis were shredded. The monarchy, for all its pomp and ceremony, had been hijacked from within by stealth. Charles sat motionless as the confessions poured out like poison. Each word was a reminder that his house was compromised, not by rebels or outsiders, but by those wearing the crown's colors. The king realized that absolute loyalty was no longer a ceremonial expectation. It was a necessity. He didn't just fire the enablers, he stripped them of their titles and privileges, effectively erasing their existence from the royal staff. The invisible empire Camilla had built was collapsing under the weight of its own deception. But as the names were cleared and the traitors were removed, a haunting question remained in the air. How could he ever feel safe in these walls again? The purge was complete, but the emotional scars on the king's heart were only beginning to harden. The monarchy, throughout its 1,000-year history, has rarely announced its internal wars with a shout. Its most devastating victories are often achieved in a silence so profound it rings in the ears of those who know the truth. For Queen Camilla, the end of her influence did not come with a public trial or a televised disgrace. It came with the quiet, clinical precision of an administrative purge. King Charles, acting with the cold clarity of a sovereign protecting his bloodline, ordered the immediate stripping of Camilla's legal and financial capacities. Effectively, immediately, she was removed from every board, every trust, and every inheritance-related committee. The woman who had sought to rewrite the future of the crown had become, in a single afternoon, a figurehead without function. This was what the inner circle called exile wrapped in silk. To the outside world, the palace facade remained unshaken. A carefully crafted statement was released, citing health concerns and the Queen's need for prolonged rest and reflection. It was a masterpiece of royal PR, a narrative designed to pacify the public while masking a total internal collapse. But behind the stone walls, the reality was far more final. Charles authorized the recall of every document bearing her influence. Every memo, every directive, and every unauthorized instruction tied to the conspiracy was logged, reviewed, and nullified. This wasn't just a correction. It was a total erasure of her hand from the monarchy's future. The most haunting moment came as evening fell over Buckingham Palace. There were no shouting matches, no grand protests. Camilla, a master of poise until the very end, offered no public denial. Perhaps she realized that the machine she had tried to hijack had finally crushed her own ambitions. A black car rolled quietly toward the palace's rear entrance, away from the prying eyes of the media and the tourists at the front gates. There were no staff lining the corridors to bid her farewell. No ceremonial guards stood at attention. Just a quiet, solitary departure into the shadows of a country estate, far removed from the levers of power she had so desperately tried to pull. As the taillights of the car disappeared into the London fog, King Charles remained in his study, a man who had reclaimed his house but lost his partner. The air in the palace felt different, heavier, stiller, and cold in a way that no fireplace could warm. He had saved the legacy of Prince Louis and Princess Charlotte, but the cost was a fractured heart and a throne that felt more isolated than ever. The Queen was gone, not with a bang, but with a whisper that echoed through the empty halls, leaving behind a void that no court musician could ever fill. As the shadows of betrayal were finally purged from the corridors of Buckingham Palace, King Charles moved to execute the most vital act of his reign. This was the moment of restoration, the point where the damage done in the dark was brought into the unforgiving light of justice. In a private chamber, far from the cameras and the ceremonial robes, and entirely devoid of Camilla's presence, the king opened a new will. This was not a mere administrative update. It was a moral declaration. It was a grandfather reclaiming the future for his own blood. Imagine the atmosphere in that room, solemn, quiet, yet charged with a resolute purpose. Charles sat at a massive mahogany table, stripped of the royal pomp, appearing not just as a sovereign, but as a protector. He had summoned only his most trusted legal minds, those untainted by Camilla's shadow court, men and women whose integrity had survived the recent firestorm. Before them lay the new document, pristine and untouched by deception. This was the original intent of the king, now secured behind layers of unbreakable protocol. As the pages were turned with clinical precision, they reached the section that had once been a chilling void, the space where Camilla had attempted to erase the next generation. Now, the names of Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis stood proudly etched in ink, unmistakable, indisputable, and irrevocable. Their future, and the future of the House of Windsor, had been restored by the very man whose crown they would one day honor. Every legal loophole had been welded shut. No memo, no optimization, and no shadow directive could ever reinterpret what was now plainly written. Within those palace walls, a quiet breath of relief seemed to ripple through the air. It was as if the monarchy itself had finally inhaled after weeks of being suffocated by conspiracy. The moral balance of the crown had been recalibrated. The rightful heirs were no longer victims of a silent omission. They were secured by the king's own hand. However, the path to truth was not without its critics. Even as the ink dried, a few advisers murmured about the optics, the public scandal of a queen disappearing without explanation, followed by a sweeping reversal of the king's will. They feared a media crisis, but Charles did not flinch. He raised a hand to silence the room and delivered the words that would define his legacy. The monarchy stands on truth, not convenience. There would be no spin, no softening of the blow, and no half measures. The document was sealed and archived through every proper channel. For the first time in months, there were no shadows in the king's study, only the clear, bright light of a legacy restored. In the days following the restoration of the royal will, Buckingham Palace appeared outwardly unchanged to the passing tourists and the world's media. The flags flew high, the guards marched with rhythmic precision, and the machinery of the state continued to grind forward. But for King Charles, the world had fundamentally shifted. With the firestorm of betrayal now contained behind closed doors, he did something rare for a monarch. He allowed the king to step back so the grandfather could finally breathe. He retreated to the private gardens, away from the sterile hallways and the echoing silence of his study, to find the only medicine that could heal a fractured heart, the laughter of his grandchildren. Imagine King Charles standing beneath the shade of an ancient oak tree, the same tree he had climbed as a young boy. He isn't wearing the heavy robes of the state or the medals of a commander. He is simply a man in a worn tweed coat, watching Prince Louis dart across the grass after a butterfly, and Princess Charlotte sharing a quiet secret with the garden birds. They are vibrant, full of life, and completely unaware of the war that was just waged in their names. They don't know that their legacy was almost erased by a single stroke of a pen. They don't know that their grandfather had to choose between his wife and their future. This innocence is the very thing Charles fought to preserve, a childhood untainted by the cold, calculating ambitions of the shadow court. As he watches them, the king's unvoiced battle plays out behind his eyes. In the art of physiognomy, we see a new softness in his posture, a slight relaxation in the tension of his jaw. But there is also a lingering shadow, a grief that no royal decree can nullify. To save his bloodline, he had to exile his partner. He had to look at the woman he had loved for decades and see a stranger. Every time Louis laughs or Charlotte displays her unmistakable regal poise, Charles is reminded of why the cost was worth it. He realized that the heaviest burdens a king carries are not the ones seen by the public, but the ones he carries in total silence to protect those who cannot protect themselves. In this quiet garden sanctuary, the king made a new, internal vow. It wasn't written in ink or witnessed by lawyers. It was a vow made to the earth and the ancestors who stood before him. He would guard their future with a ferocity that the palace had never seen. He would ensure that the monarchy they inherited would be built on the bedrock of truth, not the shifting sands of convenience. The wound of Camilla's betrayal remained, hidden beneath his gentle smile. But as he reached out to take Charlotte's hand, the king felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in weeks. Peace. The battle was won, the heirs were secured, and for one afternoon, the crown felt light. While the king found a fleeting sense of peace in the laughter of his grandchildren, the silence surrounding Queen Camilla was deafening. The question that now haunts every corridor of the palace and every royal watcher across the globe is simple. What happens to a queen who has been unmasked as a traitor to the bloodline? In the world of constitutional monarchies, you cannot simply erase a queen consort from the history books overnight without causing a constitutional crisis. Instead, King Charles has opted for a far more devastating punishment, a permanent, gilded isolation. Camilla has been moved to Ray Mill House, her private residence, far from the levers of power in London. But this is no peaceful retirement. It is a golden prison, where the walls are made of protocol, and the guards are there not to protect her, but to monitor her silence. Imagine the psychological toll on a woman who has spent decades climbing the treacherous ladder of royal acceptance, only to be cast down in a single afternoon. In the study of physiognomy, we often say that a person's face in isolation reveals the true weight of their choices. Palace insiders whisper that the Queen's composure has finally shattered. The sharp, strategic gaze that once commanded senior secretaries has been replaced by a vacant, haunted stare. She no longer receives the famous red boxes of state documents. She no longer has a say in the king's schedule. And most importantly, she no longer has the king's ear. Her cell is a mansion, her chains are silk, but she is, for all intents and purposes, a ghost within the House of Windsor. The king has ensured that her removal is total but discreet. Every patron, every charity, and every military affiliation she once held is being systematically reviewed. In royal circles, this is known as the Great Thinning. Her staff has been replaced by officials loyal only to the king's private office. Her phone lines are monitored, and her correspondence is vetted. Charles is not taking any chances. He knows that a woman as calculated as Camilla could still be dangerous if left with a single thread of influence. The world sees health updates and rest cycles, but those who understand the inner workings of the crown know that this is a surgical removal of a malignant influence from the monarchy's heart. What is most tragic for Camilla is the loss of the one thing she fought so hard to legitimize, her place beside Charles. To be physically alive but spiritually and politically dead to the man you betrayed is a punishment worse than any legal decree. She watches from afar as Charles dotes on the very children she tried to erase, Louis and Charlotte, and she knows that her name will forever be a footnote of caution in the royal archives. The lingering shadows of her plot have not only failed to secure her legacy, they have ensured her permanent exile in the cold, dark corners of royal history. She tried to steal the future, and in return, she lost her present. How does a 1,000-year-old institution survive a coup from within? It does so by wearing a mask so polished and so persistent that the world eventually forgets there was ever a face beneath it. As the internal purge of Camilla's enablers was completed, and her authority was stripped to the bone, the Buckingham Palace PR machine was activated with a single, cold directive: contain the damage, protect the crown. To the millions of viewers watching from their living rooms in America and across the globe, the British monarchy appeared as a picture of serene stability. But for those of us who have studied the tu huyet, or the hidden pressure points of power, the official narrative was a masterpiece of strategic omission. The palace released a series of carefully timed updates, each one designed to pacify the public while explaining away the Queen's sudden absence. They used the ultimate shield of the modern era, medical privacy, by citing health concerns and the need for a prolonged period of rest and reflection. The institution created a barrier that no journalist could ethically breach. It was the same tactic used during previous royal crises, a sanitization of the truth to prevent the public from seeing the cracks in the foundation. While Charles was in his study, looking at the forged signatures and the evidence of Camilla's betrayal, the official social media accounts were posting images of the king performing his duties with a measured, calm smile. This is the exile wrapped in silk in its final, public form. The king found himself in a torturous dilemma. He had vowed that his reign would stand on truth, not convenience. Yet he knew that the total, unvarnished exposure of Camilla's plot to disinherit his grandchildren could trigger a Republican movement that might end the monarchy itself. This is the heavy price of stewardship. He chose to restore the will in secret, to protect Louis and Charlotte in the dark, while allowing the public to believe in a peaceful transition. He realized that the palace machine, the very thing Camilla tried to hijack, was now the only thing keeping the family's dignity intact. As we analyze this public mask, we see the true nature of power. It isn't just about who sits on the throne, it's about who controls the story. The palace chose a narrative of illness over a narrative of treason. They chose to let a queen fade away rather than let a scandal burn. But for King Charles, every public smile he offered was a reminder of the war he had waged in silence. He had secured the bloodline, but he was forced to live behind a curtain of institutional secrecy, knowing that the most important victory of his life would never be recorded in the official history books. The mask was secure, but beneath it, the king was alone with the truth. What began as a single red envelope, hidden beneath a mountain of mundane bureaucracy, evolved into a storm that nearly tore the foundations of the British monarchy asunder. But as the dust settles over the gilded halls of Buckingham Palace, the landscape of power has been permanently altered. King Charles III is no longer just a monarch who reigns. He has become a king who protects. By exposing Camilla's secret plot and standing as a bulwark against the erasure of his own blood, he has redefined the meaning of the crown for a new generation. The one-minute discovery that threatened to destroy his family has instead become the crucible in which his true legacy was forged. Imagine Charles now, in the twilight of a long day, sitting once more in his study. In the art of physiognomy, we see a man whose face bears the deep, etched lines of a hard-won peace. The burden of the crown has never been heavier, yet his shoulders seem broader, his gaze more resolute. He has lost a partner, he has silenced a conspiracy, and he has endured a betrayal that would have broken a lesser man. But as he looks out toward the gardens where Louis and Charlotte play, he knows that the price of his loneliness is the security of their future. The names that were once missing from the will are now etched in stone and spirit, unmistakable, indisputable, and protected by the full weight of the sovereign's oath. This is the beginning of a new royal era, one not built on survival through secrecy, but on stewardship through moral clarity. Charles has sent a message to every corner of the palace and to every shadow in the shadow court. The bloodline is sacred, and the truth is non-negotiable. He has chosen to be a grandfather first and a king second, and in doing so, he has saved the institution he spent 70 years preparing to lead. The fracture may remain, and the scars of Camilla's exile may never fully heal, but the House of Windsor stands taller today because its foundation has been cleansed. As we conclude this investigation, we are left with a final truth. Every crown carries a weight that the public can never truly see, and every king must eventually fight a war in total silence. Charles has fought his, and he has won. The story of the missing names is no longer a story of loss. It is a story of an unbroken line. The future of Prince Louis and Princess Charlotte is no longer a question. It is a promise, secured in light by the man who refused to let them be forgotten. But the question remains, was the cost of this victory too high? Did Charles make the right choice in exiling the woman he loved to protect the legacy of his grandchildren? And what do you think the future holds for Louis and Charlotte now that the Shadow Court has been dismantled? We want to hear from you. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because the secrets of the palace are still unfolding, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next royal revelation.